sorry, I'm supposed to sit, so I'm not used to sitting, but I hope you can hear. Please wave if you can't hear. I've got two terrible sins to confess beginning tonight. The first is that I've developed a severe jealousy of Prince Harry. He has millions and millions of books that he sells, millions of them. And then he comes out, he looks absolutely miserable afterwards, every time. So, given the fact that we're talking about family trees and ancestry tonight, I'll just remind us all of his family tree. If you look back, his direct antecedent was King Charles VI of France, who was completely mad. If you then move on, we'll just take a few samples. King James V of Scotland, who was manic depressive, as probably was his daughter Mary, Queen of Scots. And then, of course, you move on to King George III of Great Britain, who was not completely bonkers, but very close to it. And if you see the number of other people who are unstable or otherwise, you see why he still looks miserable after selling all those books. Now, my second sin is possible guilt that I copied a bit from John Buchan. Now, I did read this book probably about 60 or 70 years ago. That's John Buchan's Path of the King, which came out in 1920, so it's just over 100 years old. And I read it, and it really sort of, I remembered it all the time. I was very much taken to it. But I haven't copied it, but I do feel that I got a central idea in a way from it, so I confess that. And it says in the book I confessed. Now, I'll just describe his book. Many of you read it, by the way? It's slightly out of date now, but it's a great book. He invented, what John Buchan did was to invent 13 ancestors for Abraham Lincoln. So the theme was it would start with a Viking king in Norway, and it would end with the President of the United States, who was greatly admired by Buchan as a hero at each end of the story, with 13 people in between who he invented totally, and gave a story about them, and sort of connected it up, except none of them knew each other. There was no theme in that. So his thing covered about 1,000 years, and covered two continents, obviously, Europe and North America. And it's 15 chapters, and up and down. So some of the people in the middle of this family tree weren't doing it all well. They were criminal or whatever. But the beginning chap was of course, Buchan admired Abraham Lincoln tremendously, which was what the book was about. So now consider how mine is different. The biggest change, of course, in the world since then has been the invention of DNA. And that made it more possible for people to do a kind of inventive family tree. And the hero of our book, my book, called Theo, based in New York in 2120, that's 100 years from now, the other direction, got a DNA sample, and it proved that he has European, Arabic, a little Jewish and African DNA in his body. That's the basic thing. But then in particular, and this is part of the book, there were two special bits of DNA. The first was a skeleton found in a peat bog south of Budapest. Now that happens quite often these days, but of course the sophisticated dealing with DNA has improved since then. So they actually identified it as being him as an ancestor of the hero Theo. And there was a hole in his head, so he had been murdered. That's the first. The second one also has been in the papers in a way, but I've adapted it, was a large stone tomb found in Athens when they were mending the underground railway there. It happened with the Olympic Games, they had also had to dig up huge holes in Athens and revealed this strong tomb, which has been mentioned, but I've used that. And it was identified, the body in it was identified as being another ancestor of our Theo. So that gives us two clues, as it were. It needed the archaeologists to identify the body as well as just the DNA to say who it was precisely. So, out of that, I have kind of two novels wrapped around each other. Not like this one. One consists of the life of a young couple who eventually get married in New York. They have a life in New York. He is a fairly ordinary dealer in timber, and she is a manager of care homes. And the two of them get together, they have their ups and downs. And there is a novel made out of them. If they're living in New York, they have lots of difficulties, etc., etc., etc. But inside that, woven into it, is the fact that the hero was a dreamer. He dreamt of the ancestors that he had. So instead of it being 13 stories, which John Buchan did, I have about 80, but they're much shorter than Buchan's. But they're going right the way through over 4,000 years. He did 1,000 years, I'm doing 4,000. He was doing 2 continents. I never thought of it. I didn't read this at the time to see that was happening, by the way. I looked it up afterwards, after I'd finished, to see what John Buchan did. I have 5 continents instead of 3. I don't do Australia and I don't do Antarctica, not in this book. So that is the thing. Now, how does he have dreams? Now, this is the difficult bit. How does he manage to dream? Because all the stories in it are begun with the first person singular, sometimes male, sometimes plural. But it is him dreaming, it is him being his ancestor. And this is using the old theme of Pythagoras and various other religious sects believe there is some passing on of the human soul, some other features apart from DNA of the human soul. This is known as metempsychosis. It's referred to by James Joyce and various other people. The Mormons, I think, accept it. It isn't entirely neglected, but it is. I've used it. So he is able to dream, and not only that, he's advised by his psychiatrist to put his dreams in order. In other words, they go from 4,000 odd years ago to 2120. So I'll just briefly say the geography of the thing, because it involves going right around the world, in fact going across the Atlantic twice. It starts off near the Neanderthal in Germany, which just happens to be the place where the last lot of Homo erectus has disappeared. Then moving on down to the Danube area, which is where that skeleton was discovered in the peat bog. Down to Greece, where Theseus was the king of Athens. And Siege of Troy comes into this, then moves on to Sicily, Macedonia, they join up with the army of Alexander the Great, they go off to India. This is ancestors of this family who just happen to be born and move around, take up degrees in different ways. Carthage, onto Carthage in Africa as a slave, then to Rome, the Balkans, Croatia, France, Italy, it goes on, Palestine for the Crusades, Bosnia, turning into a slave of the Turks, Istanbul, Zanzibar, slavery again, off to what is now Ghana, Jamaica, Savannah, Georgia, Baton Rouge, it goes on, ends up with Alaska, going to Russia, and back to Europe again. And as I've said, Alexander the Great, Hannibal come into it, Julius Caesar, a few, not too many name droppings, but in some places connected, not actually meeting these people, but being aware of what they did. William the Conqueror, John the Baptist, John Wesley in Savannah, Georgia, Sir John Hawkins, and Adolf Eichmann of Auschwitz. So I'm just going to give you a flavour of bits and pieces. The first bit, as you like, just an example of the sort of conversation of the young couple in New York. This is on the phone, just gives the idea of him being in trouble with his wood business and his herself, known as Ariadne, being in trouble with her care homes. He comes on the phone. "I've had a bad day at the office," said Ariadne over the phone. "You," I said, "I thought it never happened to you." "Well, it has. We've had another death from suspected food poisoning, and there's a charge of sexual harassment from one of our nurses, aged 60, against a male patient aged 95. And one of the 80-year-old women wants to marry the robot who makes all the beds." "Let's go for a drink," I suggested. "I thought you'd never ask. How was your day?" "Not much better. There's a war started between Tanzania and Utumbe, and I've got 2 container loads of hardwood stuck on a freighter up the Congo, and I've paid a 20% deposit already." "That's only money," she says. "I'm talking about death and rape." "Never mind, seen you in the bar in 20 minutes. And as I strolled along the pavement, my earpiece announced the news that New Delhi had once again become the largest city in the world with 40 million people, despite another outbreak of COVID-53. Now, just shows that they are living a life at that time in New York. Now, I'm now moving on to I'm going to do 5 short stories, just not all of them, to show roughly the kind of thing that happened. So the first one is in Italy, Lake Trasimene, the Battle of Lake Trasimene, which Marjorie knows all about, takes place when the Carthaginians invade Italy with a view to destroying Rome and its empire. And Hannibal brought elephants over the Alps in this war. And the eye of this story, therefore, is a slave from Carthage who has Greek blood in him, Egyptian and Jewish blood in him, so that the DNA developing here, is the guy who looks after elephants. And the elephant is called Beza. So the Roman army was waiting by the shores of the lake. Beza was as fast as she had ever been, but I knew she was suffering. In that heat, she needed something to drink after only 30 minutes. But Hannibal insisted we charged up and down the lines for a full 2 hours as the slaughter of the Romans proceeded. He cared about destroying Rome, but not for the life of an elephant. I knew that and hated him for it. At last the battle was over. The green slime around the edge of the lake was blotched with red, where Roman bodies had slipped through the canopy of water weeds. At last Hannibal dismissed us with a brief word of thanks, and I took Beza to the deeper water. But I knew it was too late. She lay there with her trunk in the lake, drinking listlessly, and then slept. I waited in that disgusting place till the end, and then made my decision. When I saw that Beza was dead and the sun had set, I crept out of the camp and headed up into the hills. By dawn, I had covered about 8 miles and stumbled upon a couple of goat herds with their throats cut, doubtless by fleeing soldiers. I didn't know which side, but most likely Romans. The huge herd of goats stood as if waiting orders, so I picked up the pipes that were lying by the bodies and brought the herd together. Then, half following, half leading, I drove them all to a farmstead, the only one that I could see. I could not speak the farmer's language, but I could make him understand what had happened, and he would see that I knew now how to handle animals. Thus it was that a Carthaginian elephant slave turned into an Italian goat herd and a free man, more or less. Now, I'm saying that is an example. It's also an example of how they shift around. In other words, the DNA has moved from North Africa to Italy, and it carries on with Italy for a while. I'm now doing another one which is late in the Roman Empire, as it happens, and goes into religion. And I hope I don't annoy anybody with this. but this is a Roman soldier on the borders near Danube again, because the family seem to drift towards the Danube quite often. As visited by a priest from the church, saying, "Soldier, do you or do you not accept the Trinity?" the new priest asked. He had not long arrived at our barracks in Aquincum. I pretended I didn't understand what he was talking about. "God the Father, God the Son, and the Holy Ghost, three in one," he went on, with an expression on his face designed to inspire dread. I had begun to hear stories of heretics being reported to the magistrates, and I knew the penalties were severe, usually burning. Bishop Arius had fairly stirred things up. "Recite after me the Nicene Creed," he said. "If you don't accept it, you will be damned." I think that's enough of that. The whole idea there is we bring in a religious element which comes from time to time in this book. And this is the first example of Christians executing other Christians, and also of two types of Christian having wars with each other, because there were a number of wars between the Unitarians and the Trinitarians in that period. The Goths included. The Goths, who eventually crossed the Danube and then conquered Rome, they became Unitarian Christians until that was got rid of. Now shifting forward 1,000 odd years plus, and we moved via Croatia to Istanbul and then on to Zanzibar, where the eye of this story has become half a Turk and still retained the other bits of the DNA, and has married a black slave lady. One of the daughters goes up the river from Zanzibar to look for her own parents, our grandparents as it were. When I was 15, I was betrothed to a Baza warrior, about 2 years older than myself. But almost immediately afterwards, the war started, and nearly all the men, including my father and my betrothed, were killed by Emos. So we women were rounded up and marched to the river in chains, and they exchanged us for beads and cowrie shells. For a month, we went down the river, which got wider and wider, and then we had to wade out to a big canoe, and were paddled to an even bigger boat that was tied to the water by a long rope. This boat had 8 pieces of cloth that hung above it and flapped in the wind, but we only saw them every 2 days, because most of the time we were shut in boxes and only sometimes allowed to walk in the air. There was a grand chief who wore a huge white collar and was called Sergeant Hawkins. He would stand by his wooden circle and laughed at us. But the rest of the time we just had to lie on the wooden floor, and I made my elbow red with scratching. I was so mad. We were on that boat for a very long time, and several of the women in my box died and were thrown into the sea. Many times the water got very angry and tried to knock down the boat. Sometimes we were cold and wet, other times it was so hot down there that we could hardly breathe. But I survived. We got off the boat in a different land and never saw the boat or Sergeant Hawkins again. And that, of course, is them reaching Jamaica from what was then the Gold Coast. She's DNA, pretty large proportion African at this point, but the DNA shifts. And that does also introduce the dealings of slavery, which happen elsewhere in the book. Jamaica. One of the descendants escapes from Savannah, Georgia. That's where they're told about hell by John Wesley. And then they escape again. So they do escaping because a sort of half-black, half-Jewish, goodness knows mixture of races at this point is not particularly popular with the United States of America. And so they head for Alaska. And even when Alaska is sold by the Russians to the USA, they don't want to stay in Alaska, so they move to Russia. So this accounts for the moving round thing. So now we get to Poland. This is the last historical example that I'm doing. 6 months later, I married a Polish girl from Krakow. And 3 of us managed to move a bit further away from the ghetto. But the stares of the policemen kept getting harder. Most of the obvious Jews had now been moved out of the city. "I think you're at least half a Jew, Fensky," said the foreman in the engine shed. Yes, I should have mentioned that this group of descendants had become engine drivers. They became engine drivers when they moved from Alaska to Vladivostok and they started doing the Trans-Siberian Railway. So this is the 3rd generation of railway drivers. "Not me," I replied. "Never been to a synagogue in my life, Gaffer." "Maybe not," he said, "but we have special assignments for people like you. They don't want you going to the Eastern Front anymore. Spoils the atmosphere. No, there's a new run. Now, from now on, you're 3 times weekly to Oswiecim. The rolling stock's a bit past it, but good enough what you'll be carrying." I left his office relieved that I hadn't been sacked or conscripted, and took myself off to the remote siding whose number he'd given me. "Jewish factory workers being shipped south," said the clerk with a clipboard. "Nearly finished loading." To my surprise, I saw Germans cramming extra people into each truck and then padlocking the doors, but I asked no questions. "Work breaks free," said one of the Germans and winked at me, and I winked back, and 10 minutes later I had the long train lumbering slowly out of Warsaw towards the southern trunk line. "Good trip, dear?" asked my little wife, smiling when I got home 2 days later. "Not bad," I said. "What's that smell?" she asked. "They gave me a bunk right beside the rubbish incinerator," I said. "It's ponged my boiler suit." "It sure has," she said. "Never mind, I'll wash it before you go off in the morning." "I brought you this," I said, handing her a little gold bracelet which I'd found in one of the trucks. "That's lovely," she said. "Now that my job seems a bit more secure, I think we should move up near the Worcester," I said. "And we're so lucky," she said. Well, in fact, afterwards, he had trouble just saying that he was not Jewish at all. And after running the trains to Oswiecim, which, and again, it helps in this book, there are, if you're not sure where Oswiecim, that's Auschwitz, the Polish name for Auschwitz. There's some of these things which are not obvious. There's a sort of gazetteer at the back which tells you that the different name of the place and the different name of the person. Yes, this guy, having failed to persuade everybody that he was not a Jew, and then failed to persuade the Jews that he was pro-Jew, he fled to Argentina. So, on top of all that, we have the 2 sides of the novel, where they're going between New York and back with historical dreams. We have the news being pumped out all the time. So I'd just like to give you a short example, and that'll be the end of it. This is overnight prices on the Nikkei and the Hang Seng had slipped because of the Chinese asteroid war, but the yen was still strong against the dollar. However, we then have one of my favorites, actually, if you remember Donald Trump. Mexico is planning a wall to keep out migrants and asylum seekers bringing cheap drugs into Mexico from the USA. The massive tomb of Vladimir Putin in Red Square has been demolished and his coffin transferred to an unmarked grave in Chernobyl. There were signs of a possible ceasefire after North China agreed to hand over one of its smaller asteroids to the south. So, not bad. Thank you for listening, but not too bad a time.
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was excellent. And unlike some people, you can actually hear Oliver when he's speaking, which is a big improvement. I'd like to remind you all that his books are available at the till, and that Oliver will be signing copies of the books at the table here. Thank you all for coming out, especially on such a horrible night, but I'm sure you all regard it as more than worth it. Thank you. Thanks again, Oliver.